Andrés Jaque is an architect, writer, and curator, and he's the founder for the Office of Political Innovation, which is based in New York and Madrid. And he works at the intersections of research and enviro-bodily practices, as well as design. In 2016, the office received the 10th Frederick Kiesler Prize for Architecture and the Arts, and he's also been awarded the Silver Lion for the best research at the 2014 Venice Biennale. Projects include the IKEA Disobedience, Meets the Phantom Rendered Society, Superpowers of 10, Pornified Homes, Climate-Dissident House in Neverland. I've kind of picked those out because I felt like they were the ones that resonated most deeply with the phrase that the interplay of dispositions, which is a phrase that's used to describe your work. Something that can be sort of understood through notions of fluidity and meaning and its associations. The work has been part of a collection at MoMA, New York Art Institute, Chicago, the Biennale in the UK, the MAC, Vienna, PS1, the Whitechapel, amongst other galleries around the world. He was the chief curator of the 13th Shanghai Biennale, entitled Bodies of Water. With that event, the president of the PSA, the academic committee, Hyde, describes his approach to curation of bodies of water in terms of sort of the fluidity of forms that explore the possibilities of self-renewal. He's a director of the Advanced Architectural Design Program at Columbia and taught there amongst other places. And he's published all over the place, Superpowers of Scale, more recently, and then More Than Human, Transmaterial Politics, Phantom. This is not everything, because if it's everything, I'm here. We just have time for him to say hello at the end of it. The performance of Superpowers of Scale was what I managed to see of it, for me is resonant of the legacy of the great surrealist filmmakers from Buñuel, Truffaut, Pedro Almodovar, and more recently, Guy Ben-Nur's Wild Boy, was an adaptation out of Truffaut's Wild Child. So potentially this work continues to assert that reality is produced at the intersections of things like interior design, pornography, maintenance, territorial distribution of toxicity. These are my attempts to describe your work. But they do resist easy categorization and description. But I want you to join me in welcoming Andrés Jaque and his complex and fascinating body of work from the Office of Political Innovation. Andrés, thank you. I hope this all works.
Thank you very much, Jason, for this amazing presentation and to bring reference that are so dear to me in the film, in the ecosystem of film practices that I really think that it's so connected to architecture now. So, and I also loved your final intersections, because I believe that they very well depict not only what I do, but also some of the most important issues that are happening now to the world, at least from my point of view. I'm incredibly happy to be here. I had never been in Lincoln before, and I'm very excited. I've been reading these days a lot about the city, but also about Nebraska at large and its territories. And for me, it's very important to understand that we no longer live in cities. I'm coming from New York, but I believe that the way we live is very much entangled with much more complex territorialities that exceed the traditional categories of scales that we normally use in architecture. I don't think city, body, territory is the same that it was 15 years ago or 20 years ago. I think we live across, transitioning from those categories, that we are land, we're territories in the same way that we're bodies. All territories are bodies in the way that they're configuring how life is enacted. And that's the focus of my work, and this kind of insistence of scale, because my opinion is that we have to redefine many of the tools that architecture operates through. This is a photograph that for me it's very, it has the character of kind of a manifesto for architecture. It's a photograph that was taken. Sorry, things are dropping today, but maybe it's easier like this. Is that okay? Okay, probably. But this is a photograph that, for me, it was very surprising because this was taken. I took this photograph in a part that is very unknown, of one of the most photographed architectural devices of the history of modern architecture, namely the Barcelona Pavilion. But the Barcelona Pavilion has a part that is totally concealed, which is this basement. Not that many people know that actually the entire footprint of the reconstruction of the pavilion, that was the 1929 pavilion that Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich designed for Barcelona, was reconstructed in the 1980s with the rise of Spanish democracy as a symbol of modernity, kind of leaving behind the obscure times of the Franco historicist architecture. But the architects that this... Yeah. No, but it's okay. I wanted to stay here. Yeah. Okay, but maybe we can move. Yeah. You know this, right? Everyone knows this. So this is the famous photograph of the Barcelona Pavilion. Yeah, no, thank you, Jason, because I think it's much easier too. But basically, the previous one is the basement of this. So what is interesting is that we've all seen these photographs, right? Many, many times, but no one paid attention that there was a basement there. This is actually, for me, what is important. This is what, for me, the Barcelona Pavilion is. And it's very important that we move from this image to this. Architecture is a discipline that deals with realism. So how do we make sense of an image like this? That is the question that I'd like to bring today. Or how do we make sense of something like this? When we see what's going on in the basement, we understand that there's so many things that need to be removed from the upper floor in order for it to remain so pristine, so kind of minimalistic, so elegant. That elegance on top requires removal to the basement. And removal of what? That's the thing. What is removed? Because when we see on the left image what happens here, what we see is that what is removed is actually the microwave that the employees need to warm up their lunch. So what is removed is actually things that are incredibly important for our daily lives. Somehow, the upper part is voided with a big part of the life or the associations of architecture has with bodies in order to promote life. And the other thing is why there's such an effort in removing all these things, because when we see what the employees of the Barcelona Pavilion are doing on the wall, it's not that different to what Mies was doing. It's kind of the same culture of collage that was mobilized by Mies van der Rohe and his entire cultural context to produce symbols and meaning through architecture. So what are those divides? What is the way that architecture is saying who can do collage and who cannot? What needs to be hidden and what needs to be in order for other things to become super visible? When we look at these arrangements, this is actually very complexly telling us the story, the material story of the pavilion. The marble that was used in the pavilion is this travertine marble. Jeff was telling me now that the Philip Johnson building here was for a while the most expensive one in the US, right? Built in the US. And it was using this same marble, the marble from Rome, of course. And that is used for the sidewalks in Rome, of course. But what is important is that Mies van der Rohe wanted those holes to remain open, so the texture of the marble would be kind of earthy. And because it's like this, they were kept like this, and the mud gets there, and the water gets there, and the slabs end up breaking. And those pieces are carefully taken to the basement by the employees of the pavilion so they can be restored. There's a permanent labor of restoring, classifying, maintaining the pavilion. The pavilion is not a fixed construction. It very heavily depends on a permanent process of reconstruction. But what is interesting is that when we look at the upper floor, it doesn't look like if it was maintained. It was dependent on all this labor. on all this resin, on all this glue that is permanently once and again enacted as part of the pavilion, but needs to be invisibilized because everyone wants to believe that the pavilion is a frozen instant of the spring of 1929 when it was opened. This idea of architecture to paralyze instances of fictional reality is what intrigues me. Why do we need this? This is the way the curtains start aging after a while. Basically, the radiation of the sun, the UV rays of the sun, start changing the color of the velvet, and after a while, they're taken to the basement and they are replaced by new ones. This is a whole, let's say, dependence on an industrial tissue. The pavilion is enacted at other scales. The pavilion requires the industry that keeps producing velvet. And actually, if you look at the historical photographs of the pavilion, you will see how progressively the velvet in the pavilion became lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter. Why? Because originally it came from the textile industry of Germany that was producing very heavy velvet that was used mostly for interiors to keep them warm. But progressively, they moved to the Barcelona tradition of the fabrics that came from sailing. And they needed very, very light sails that would be resistant to keep the wind, but good light enough to not stop the boats. We see how the pavilion is actually part of a larger context, a context that cannot be stopped, that cannot be frozen, that cannot be stabilized, and that is depending on much more larger societal entanglements. When we look at this, we see that this is actually a machine to hide a big part of the material extensions and many of the transcolor constructions the pavilion depends on to create this fantasy, this architectural fantasy or this architectural symbolic discourse that architecture is detached from the societal. We see here how entangled it is and how difficult it is to present the pavilion, how much it's needed to show the pavilion as disentangled. So that's what is intriguing for me. Why we inherited a culture that is heavily entangled within the social, within the ecosystemic, within the political, but architecture is equipping itself so that entanglement remains hidden, invisible. It's like if architecture was evolving in a way that power needs to be invisibilized. And I think that it has to do with a way, of course, of removing power from others, from the employees, for instance, that they have to do like if they didn't need a microwave oven, like if life was not composed by them. It's a process of removal, actually, of a big part of the society that therefore becomes, let's say, invisibilized. This is, for me, what is the kind of alliance that the Barcelona Pavilion is part of. In order to preserve this kind of fictional image, it needs to remove a big part of reality so that it becomes kind of an invisibilized reality. But what does it imply? How does it work? What does it mean to be a body that is subsidized by another symbol, by a symbolism that invisibilizes you, that avoids to express you, to manifest your presence? This is for me the most important part of the basement of I would say is the most important part of the pavilion. I think that if we had to find what is the moment in which the contemporary dimension of this pavilion most clearly manifests, is here. Not in the Colbert sculpture. You remember this Colbert sculpture of the Morgan, the woman that is raising her arms to prevent the sun from kind of reaching her eyes. For me, this is actually the contemporary version I would propose of Colbert's sculpture, and it's the place where Kat Niebla lived. This is Kat Niebla. She died 3 years ago, very sadly. I met her maybe now, I think something like 15 years ago, when I was first visiting this basement. And she was then quite old already. She was sent there because there were mice in the pavilion. And the architects are in charge of the maintenance of the pavilion thought that mice were not something that should be part of the, let's say, cosmopolitical construction of the Miss work. So they brought Cat Niebla as an architectural actor, as an architectural technology, I would say, that was intended to remove from the cosmopolitical composition of the pavilion those presences, those components, mice. And she was taken to the basement where she lived, and only 2 hours at night she would be taken to the upper part to do her job. What is interesting and sad at the same time is that her name, Niebla, was given to her quite late in her life, because as you see in her eyes, she developed her eyes became a little bit foggy. This is because she progressively developed macular atrophy due to the fact that she was spending most of her life in the darkness of the basement. And for me, this is, if we want to stop here and reflect a little bit what it means, we see that architecture is very different to what we have been told. Architecture is not the provision of space. Architecture is an assemblage. Architecture is not just a box where any form of body or society can be hosted, as normally is claimed through the minimalistic tradition, or the tradition of minimalism. Architecture is the society, actually. How is it composed? Through bodies, through velvet, through industries, through many, many different entities that get associated in the way life is enacted. And in this way, architecture is reflectivity. Cat Niebla is constructing the pavilion, but at the same time, she was constructed as part of the pavilion. And this is not just a, let's say, conceptual process. It's very physical. The anatomy of her eyes were transformed by the way she became part of this assemblage. Of course, this is something that many people from different perspectives have been reflecting on in the field of the STS, of the studies of science, society, and technology, through the evolution of the actor network theory. This is something that is being characterized, but also, of course, people that has worked in the post-human field also have been characterizing this. People that are working on the field of political ecology has been also reflecting on these issues. And I think it's important that we understand that architecture is at the center of this reflection, and that we are incredibly important in contributing to understand what is the way that societies are materially produced, and what is the way that bodies are directly connected to environments, they're directly connected to industries. And the life that we live is not self-contained by, let's say, our individuality. We're not zipped-up entities in the same way that Cat Niebla is not a zipped-up entity. We are constructed in collectiveness, and that collectiveness is produced out of the articulation of many numerous heterogeneous entities. That is what, for me, is a fundamental change in the way architecture can be understood, conceptualized, practiced now. Architecture is no longer the provision, for me, conceptually, at this point in history, is not the provision of space. It's the enactment of assemblages of heterogeneous entities. And that's why I believe that we're facing a huge change in architecture now, in which architecture can be understood as bodied, in the same way that we could say that it could be understood as environmentalized. For us working, what I presented today is a tiny part of research that my office and myself did since 2007. And that ended up with this installation at the Barcelona Pavilion. It took us a long time to discuss internally what should be our installation out of these reflections that I was sharing with you. And we ended up thinking that the way to operate in an assemblage is through rearticulation. Not that much, for instance, by just taking people to the basement. That was something that we were thinking, but rather considering that we could reassemble, that we could if we had to intervene something, it is the assemblage that what needed to be intervened. And the assemblage, for instance, intervening the assemblage was basically reconsider what should be visible and what should be hidden, not producing a kind of the fantasy of a universal transparency, but understanding that visibility is constructed and therefore could be intervened and could be rediscussed. But for instance, by showing the vacuum cleaners that were used by the cleaning staff to remove the water that gets into the hole of the travertine to slow down the process of for the stone to break, basically totally transformed the hierarchy in the pavilion. The cleaning, the people that were working on the cleaning would then become the curators. They would decide when they would clean, how that would be staged so people could see that process. Rearticulating is not just affecting the symbolic dimension of the pavilion, it is affecting the symbolic dimension of the pavilion, but also the daily life and the hierarchies that the assemblage, the pavilion exists through, exists by, exists as, consisted. And Kolbe's sculpture, as you see, lost its importance. It was no longer important. It was much more important other bodies that could start to become visible here. I would like now to move to something connected to the story of the Barcelona Pavilion, which is this building, 432 Park Avenue. Do you know this building? Yeah. This building was designed, it's normally credited to Raphael Vignoli, and some authors that are more accurate, they say Raphael Vignoli and Deborah Berg, who produced mostly fictional images of the interiors of the tower. My impression is that it's equally important to credit D-Box, the architectural branding company that did the rendering and the kind of branding of the entire building, and as such, they produced this rendering. But let me explain a bit more. What for me it's important is that this building is dividing architects now and architectural critics. On the one hand, there's people that believe that this is an elegant design. It's a design, of course, that we could identify as connected with Hoffman's work, right? It could be also connected to Sol Levitt, sculpture work. It's kind of an elegant, simple structure that could be appreciated aesthetically within the paradigm, let's say, of minimalism, or within the tradition of postmodern modernity, we could say. But then there's other people, that other voices that are connecting this building with the making of inequality across the world, and very specifically in a place like New York. Those controversies between those that believe that a building like this is an actor, a player in the making of inequality, and those that believe that architecture has very little to do with inequality, that is just an elegant solution. What can the architects do? Do they have any power to change inequality? Is the building directly connected to it, or is just, let's say, a passive active in the enactment of inequality? I think that it's important to understand how societies are produced in order to respond or to intervene in this controversy. I think that it's important to see architecture from a different perspective, to understand how deeply materiality, design, is connected to the making of inequality in the world now. And it's precisely how to understand, how to mobilize critically the way architecture contributes to the making of inequality, how we can also understand other ways of characterizing architecture that are relevant for the times that are living. Let me get a little bit more in detail. This is the first image that was produced by D-Box in order to conceptualize this building. This is actually the first image that allowed to design the rest. And as you see here, the way that it was explained is that you own the view. You own the view as you would own a painting, right? That's why the surface of the view is a glass, a floating glass that turns the sky, a commodity that could be acquired expensively as you could acquire a painting, an oil painting. But not only that, of course, owning the view is very much connected to the construction of a very particular character, this kind of flamboyant, wealthy person. Why is wealthy? Because that chair was very recently, I mean, when this was done, had just been auctioned by Christie's, and it had become one of the most expensive pieces of architectural furniture that had been traded. When we see the building is a repetition of that conceptual image. It's just by addition of many, many devices that allow to own the landscape that a building is produced. And this, of course, happens in a context of decades that New York City has been struggling to produce an economy after the disappearance of the harbor in downtown. The harbor in downtown disappeared because it could not compete with Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the harbor that could develop all this system of ship containers exchange from the boat to the road, to the tracks. That's something that in the 1970s, with the development of the standardized ship containers that was directly related to the logistics of the Vietnam War, made New York City actually lose a big part of its economy. And different mayors since then have been struggling to promote, to lead the transition of New York to a different economy, but it's been almost kind of the only idea that the real estate industry in the city would be the alternative to the harbor. And probably it was Michael Bloomberg who most clearly stated it when he said that he wanted to attract billionaires from all around the world, and they would be a godsend. That was done through a combination and an articulation of many different forms of design. As a story tracked for the New York Times, the development of a regulation that would allow LLC companies to be used as shell companies to buy properties in the city without revealing who the owner was behind those acquisitions, made it possible that money from all around the world could be laundered in New York and escape taxation. But also, there were tax deductions that were specifically developed to promote that billionaires could buy high-end properties in the city, and a large amount of public money was placed into promoting those sales. Actually, this is not something that, of course, escaped public opinion. You probably remember during the time of COVID how around the world the discussion of how money had flowed to the promotion of real estate around the world through high-end properties was actually directly connected to by activists of tax justice to the lack of health facilities around the world. So basically, there was all these designs were redistributing public money to promote this economy. But when we look at the way that the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, when they were made public, we saw the huge dimension probably for the first time of the offshore industry. An offshore industry that was heavily promoted through architectural design, but that design was like the basement of the pavilion somehow. It was hidden as the way newspapers depicted architecture proved. When we see the way that these buildings or the participation of architecture in the making of tax evasion across the world, we see that it was quite naive. It was perceived, it was depicted as these kind of white villas in tropical islands. But if you remember what is the way that the European Union struggled when they wanted exactly to identify where were the tax havens around the world, you will see that it was not tropical islands where tax havens were being installed. It was actually Switzerland, Hong Kong, USA, Singapore, Luxembourg, Lebanon, Germany, United Emirates, Japan, Panama, United Kingdom. So basically, it was not tropical islands. The offshore economy, tax evasion, was deeply imbricated. It was deeply entangled with the cities that became, or that were called for a long time global cities, or cities that would become international. Israel, Guatemala, Belgium, Ireland, Chile, the Netherlands, Italy, Aruba, Sweden, Gibraltar, New Zealand, Norway, Mexico, all these countries had specific forms of architecture that were developed in combination with regulations like the possibility of using LLC companies or tax deductions as a way to basically produce the possibility that public money could flow to private ownership. And that's something that was also enacted through the building. When we see this to the design, the detailed design of this building, I would like now to pay attention to this image that was also produced by D-Box, where we see Christina Makowski, the model, the sport illustrated model that was selected among more than 400 candidates by D-Box. It's introduced in this fictional scene of the building. This is all rendered. It was shot on Chroma in Queens in Silver Cat Studios. And I would like you to pay attention to what is happening here. All these people here are actors or models except one person, which is this chubby guy over there who is a real businessman from New Jersey. He's called by the D-Box team the Danny DeVito guy. And the Danny DeVito guy, it's intended to create the illusion that through the mediation of this building, romance could be possible between that businessman and that woman. This is a way, of course, of sexualizing architecture to make it desirable to potential buyers. And of course, everything here is engineered. Nothing is, let's say, naive. Take into account that the artistic director of this image, Matthew Bannister, is an architect, educated, a Princeton graduate that was educated at the time that Beatriz Colomina, Liz Diller, Jules Sander were actually working on sex architecture, let's say, and this is not something that came as naive. There was a long tradition of identifying these tools that he took advantage of and brought to the making of images like this to sexualize this building. Actually, the image that you see here is very much inspired by one of the most famous and successful photographs in the history of Instagram, which is this picture of Kim Kardashian wearing this Lanvin shirtless tuxedo. The version that Christina Makowski is wearing is from Armani, so kind of a much more dignified version of the same way, but it was already tested. So the technologies that are mobilized here are not new, are technologies that had already been developed in the field of architecture through theory, and in the field, of course, of PR and image making in the case of Kim Kardashian. Let's look a little bit more in detail to what are these windows doing. Because if you have the image, for instance, of the way penthouses were depicted in New York in the past, you will always remember the huge importance that skyline had in those penthouses. But 432 is not showing the skyline, it's showing the sky. And that's a fundamental change. It's not about the city, it's about owning the environment. It's bodies connected to the air. It's the air what is owned here. And when we see here the air, it's very clear. It's owning the sky. The quality of the air is fundamental. Actually, the very detailing of the architecture, the materiality of the architecture, is contributing to this possibility. No window in 432 can be opened. And the reason why those windows cannot be opened is because you immediately could discover that this glass, ultra clear glass with a very specific coating, is calibrated so that it maximizes the color, the intensity of the color of the spectrum of the blue in the natural light. So basically, when you look through this glass, that is an Austrian glass that is particularly expensive, you see the sky bluer than what it is actually. And this is something that, of course, is very intentional. The use of ultra-clear glass across the world became massive in the high-end industry. Ultra-clear glass is encapsulating power. It's producing power nowadays. You will probably have in mind the image of the Apple stores. Apple stores is basically a celebration of being encapsulated by ultra-clear glass. Everything is ultra-clear glass. Ultra-clear glass is a form of glass that is low iron, it has low iron content. So it doesn't have this typically greenish color of the conventional glass. It's eliminated that, but it does it by using a very particular kind of silica and increasing immensely the energy that is required to produce it, to melt it, and to cool it down, and increasing its emissions, of course. But if you have a feeling of what is the way the renderings have changed in the last 10 years, you will see that 15 years ago, renderings were showing buildings with reflections on the windows. Now, contemporary renderings are showing white glass, a glass that, in the words of renderings experts, say they use the sentence "millions floating in the air" as a way to describe how to represent the glass of power structures around the world now. So we're in a fundamental. What we see here is a fundamental change in architecture, a fundamental change to cater to the high-end industry, a fundamental way for architecture to mobilize materiality, language, aesthetics, to create a new class, this class of those that can avoid taxation and that are encapsulated 24/7 by ultra-clear glass. But what is interesting is, for me, is that the silica that is required to produce this can only be found in very particular places around the world. Places like this, Ottawa in Illinois, where the extraction of the silica, low iron silica, was first initiated, and that it's the place where different Native American peoples were finding the opportunity to develop a very sustainable relationship with the environment. This silica has a very particular grain. Has a very particular structure. I think I have a picture here. Yeah, this is the way it is extracted now, but this is what it looks like. It's the grains of the silica, of this white silica, are very rounded, as you see here, but incredibly strong. So these formations allow the water to flow. They become like big sponges that are hosting and nurturing a large spectrum of biodiversity, first plants, fungi, but then insects and animals that live there. What is interesting is what can we learn from the very different way that humans took advantage of this particularity of the silica. In the past, it was basically celebrated and used as a very particular ecosystem where people could hunt and could develop a very sustainable relationship with more than human force of life. In the kind of end of this culture of extraction, silica became a possibility to create inequality, to create segregation, to take further the possibility of a culture of exploitation. And for me, that's quite intriguing, where are we now and how distant we are with the other paradigm that was enacted through the same material, through silica. When we look at this, it's basically what ultra-clear glass looks like. Just marble, just owning the sky, just having the possibility of having a croissant by being part of this enactment of exploitation. But when we see this, this is also related to fracking. There's no way to produce glass, ultra-clear glass, without fracking. The development of the glass industry in Pittsburgh was directly connected to the exploitation of natural gas in Susquehanna Valley and in other parts of the US. There's ultra-clear glass because there's 73% of the energy that is used in producing it comes from fracking. And of course, very rapidly, but we could get much more in detail, the extraction of gas in Susquehanna Valley is directly connected, and I've been working for many, many years with a series of activists, organizations in Susquehanna Valley that have been doing survey on the damage produced by fracking, and there's more than 30,000 miles of aquifers that are polluted through fracking, that have been polluted through fracking. Basically we see this glass is a glass that it's directly connected to a redistribution, a project to redistribute toxicity territorially. And I would like to get more in detail, but before I get to that, I must say that it's paradoxical that our culture as architects, it's actually not identifying, not detecting what is happening with this glass. And using ultra-clear glass gives you automatically 2 points in LEED certificate. So basically, the way we evaluate sustainability is totally not understanding how architecture is operating through all these different scales, and how the action of putting a glass here means that something happens in Susquehanna or something happens in Illinois that we have to take into account. The seals of kind of these ways to evaluate sustainability are not operating transcalarly, therefore are useless to identify ecological impact. We have to understand that architectural detailing is a form of socio-territorial recomposition. That's what I want to claim. Basically, there's no divorce between design and society or eco-society making. Architectural detailing is political. It's an assemblage. It's a site of assemblage that requires an assembly. This is actually a space, a site of political action, namely segregation, as it is this one. And this is directly connected to particular policies that were well-intended but ended up having a very problematic outcome. This is the 2011, the presentation of the 2011 Clean Heat project by Michael Bloomberg, by which he promoted and incentivized the transformation of boilers in New York from oil-fueled boilers to natural gas fuel boilers, the Clean Heat project. It came together, or very close together in time, with Cuomo's banning of horizontal fracking in New York State, which is something that, of course, should be celebrated, in my opinion. I'm against fracking, but because of basically the damage that it produces to societies, to governments, and to the environment, of course, and personal lives. But of course, when you put it in context together, the Clean Heat project and the banning of horizontal fracking in New York State meant that fracking was basically allocated in Susquehanna Valley in Pennsylvania, that I already mentioned, and that immediately the pollution, the NOx of New York, was moved to Susquehanna. This is the presence of NOx before the Clean Heat project, and this is the way that it moved to Susquehanna. The reason why, it's because as opposed to oil, natural gas pollutes in the point where it is extracted, not in the point where it is not that much, in the point where it is burned. It also pollutes in the place where it is burned, but much more in the place where it is extracted. So basically, by moving from from oil-fueled boilers to natural gas-fueled boilers, Bloomberg's administration, combined with the action of Cuomo's banning horizontal fracking in New York State, resulted in a displacement of toxicity from New York City to a neighboring state, Pennsylvania, that would then start having air alerts annually. This is, in my opinion, what we need to understand when we look at the 432, is that when we look at the views of 432, it's not only this flamboyant guy looking to the earth that he owns. Owning the sky by this guy means that others are not owning it. Like the cat Niebla is not part of the upper part of the, or it's kind of the victim of the making of this illusion in the upper part. There's other victims of this. The blue sky that is owned in Manhattan means basically that people have their water mixed with methane. And that's what I think is important. When we see the way this reality, the gas in the Marcellus cell, the way that it manifests to people that live on top of it, you perfectly see how they are the victims of a system of invisibilization. Because this is the way that the Marcellus cell is expressed to those that are invested in it, those that can own it. Owning the view is very much connected to owning also the mineral assets that are underneath people that live in Susquehanna Valley. This is the way predicts, as fracking wells are drilled, basically there's digital sensors in the drilling bit that are collecting data. So fracking is not only profitable because gas is extracted, but it's profitable because it allows to turn a mineral resource into an asset. So by consolidating information about the asset, it allows for it to be marketed. And therefore, it's easy to, or it optimizes its capacity to be to become an investor, tradable, a commodity that can be traded in the global markets. These are the different representations that are provided by Predix, the software that allows for those that are investing in mineral assets to decide, to make decisions on how they operate with those their investments. How many people here have Predit in their phones? Does anyone have it? Do you know it? Predit? Okay, that's kind of the basement. That's kind of the invisibility. Predit has more employees than Google. It's a huge company that is working with natural assets around the world, but probably none of us has access to that reality. So we see how those divides are directly connected to the making of architecture now in a very clear way. This is, for instance, the way you see those different lots on top of the mineral asset. Basically, those two realities are disconnected as the two stories of the Barcelona Pavilion are. And this is something that is being constructed through spatial practices. This is a map that we got from a landman that for years had been acquiring mineral rights in some parts of Susquehanna Valley. You see how progressively they were accumulating yellow lots. Those yellow lots are the ones that have sold already their mineral assets, their mineral rights to Cabot Oil Company. So they're consolidating out of these tiny fragments a huge property underneath the houses. This is all interconnected. This is all very directly connected. There's no glass that allows to have to really experience owning the blue sky that is previously been edited by Bloomberg through the transformation of the boilers that can be owned by people that can hide their properties of these apartments, that is working and ensuring this blue sky for those apartments through redistribution of toxicity territorially, we can only understand how all these things are connected if we understand architecture as an assemblage, and we understand how it operates transscalarly, transmaterially, and transmedium. And those transformations are crucial for us to understand how architecture is political, how design is political, and how architecture is never done by one single actor. It's the association of many different figures of design. And it's in those constellations of figures of design, in this case policies, energy projects like the Clean Heat project, material development, like the development of the ultra-clear glass, systems of exploitation, as the exploitation of gas and the channeling of that to the glass industry. All those different figures of design come to be assembled as well to produce a political effect. And politics are distributed, are associative, are happening in the collectiveness of architecture. So we can only hold architecture accountable if we approach it through conceptual tools that allowed us to understand how it operates across scales, mediums, collectively, and in the association of many forms of design that work together to produce politics. This is, in my opinion, a great change in architecture, and this is kind of the center of my work, the work that I've been developing, that my office and myself have been developing in the last years through very different approaches, formats, and case studies, and also projects. And this is something that we've presented in the format of performances. For instance, this is a very recent performance that we did in Performa, New York, being silica, tracking the trajectory of silica from the ecosystems that I mentioned before to the glass in the apartments, or that we've done also approaches to design. Now, as a second part of this lecture, I would like to very rapidly show a series of designs. First, designs that are a little bit more, let's say, of the past, and then I would like to show you what we're working on right now. I'd like to do this because, in a way, for me, there's all this research or kind of ideas that I've been sharing with you are directly connected to what we try to do with design. And I see design as directly connected to research, positioning, many other things that I've been talking about so far. This is a project, for instance, that we did in New York as one of these invitations by the PS1. And it's actually at the time that we were tracking the way toxicity was being rejected, kind of sent away from New York as a way to produce inequality through toxicity, territorial redistribution of toxicity. We were doing experiments with many people like John Todd, that in the 1960s were claiming that we could deal with our own shit. That's the language that they would use. On site, as a political stances, we basically developed a contemporary version of those eco-machines that could allow a place like New York City, for instance, to avoid sending its fecal matter to Kentucky, which is happening now every day through trains that leave every day New York with tons of fecal matter to Kentucky. And we did this experiment that was intended to be a demonstrative device that would directly take water from the sewage system and would introduce it through a series of engineered ecosystems. So after 2 weeks, the water that could be circulating through these different gardens could be drinkable. Actually, I drank it, and it was okay. I'm alive here. But also we wanted to show that as opposed to this notion that you have to get rid of the toxicity to have a beautiful, enjoyable environment, this could become actually something enjoyable. This could be a form of a park that could become a space for social gathering and for social aggregation. So, and these are different parties, for instance, that were program at that time around toxicity, basically. And it was designed so it could also become a little bit of a propaganda device for New York to change the way it would deal with toxicity. We also, in collaboration with the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, we always do our projects in the same way that Bloomberg connects different agencies. We, in a humble way, we also try to work with many other people. We actually work with New York Environmental Department, but also with the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and we, together with them, we developed this manual for anyone to construct their own Cosmo. Cosmo was the name of this project. And actually, I keep in touch with more than 15 people that have Cosmo machines in their gardens now. And actually, when we dismounted this device, we gave pieces of it to different people that keep having them running. This is the second project. I'm going to be slightly faster now because I would like to show that there's a way for architecture to be practiced that can intervene little pieces of things that I've been mentioning in the previous discourse. The first one is we can really demonstrate, and by demonstrating, probably introduce already the possibility of an alternative when it comes to confront environmental, the use of the distribution of toxicity as a mean for environmental injustice. But this is, for instance, a project that we've been doing for many years, also to do an embassy of the ocean in Venice, in San Lorenzo, in Campo San Lorenzo. This is the old church of San Lorenzo, and we have a long-running project for it to become a parliament of the More Than Human Alliance of the Ocean. This is something that is very already present in the building. The building can be seen already as a cosmology, but we want to reprogram the building as a cosmology that goes beyond anthropocentrism. And we're doing this working with TVA 21 Academy, which is a nonprofit organization that is devoted to the connection of scientists, activists, and artists to advocate for non-human life in the oceans that is, as you know, severely damaged now by many different ways of industrialization of the ocean. And we develop a number of, an accumulation of transformations in this place to allow for many different forms of more than human advocacy. One of them, for instance, is to bring back many of the ecosystems of the lagoon that were removed from Venice through the Napoleon urban transformation of the archipelago of Venice. The use of many different architectural techniques was intended to remove many forms of life from Venice that were very important to the kind of life that was developed then, even to the way diseases and contagious diseases were spreading, as Ivan has been studying. And for instance, we were to the tiny scale of the what is called in Venice the green line, the border of the water of the canal, and the line that is expressed through the moss and the different species that appear on the walls. We basically develop an architecture that would allow to nurture those species that are normally, or that are, I mean, if we see images or depictions from the time before of Napoleon transformation, we would see that how many species have disappeared that were fundamental for the ecosystems of the lagoon. But probably the most important part is this Parliament of the Ocean that we've been developing for years now with technologies, with interface designers, with scientists, with artists from TVA 21, that is working together with a series of boats that are distributed around the world to be live mapping realities that are critical about the ocean. For instance, one of the projects that is being developed to be managed from here, it's the tracking of the deep sea mining, of the evolution of deep sea mining around the world in the ocean. The idea is to provide this chamber that could allow to claim what is happening to the ocean now, giving visibility to it and gathering or convening decision makers with artists, with activists, with scientists to advocate for the ocean. And that is one of the, but also the evolution of biodiversity, the displacement of sharks that are changing their habitats, the effects of climate crisis in the transformation of the habitat of mackerel, for instance. All these are issues that are being discussed now and being researched and advocated for by TBA 21, and that require a chamber where they can be become visible and therefore the activism can be stronger. This is a different project, for instance, that we're completing its construction now in El Encinar de los Reyes in Madrid, which is the Reggio School. The Reggio School is an attempt to challenge hierarchies and hegemonies in education from elementary school to high school, and instead replace that by an architecture that can incorporate a large amount of diversity of situations, of environments, of climates, so that instead of having, let's say, a curriculum, it's the daily exposition to diverse situations what provides opportunities for group self-education. So the architecture is crucial in the Reggio Emilio methodology that we've been working with these teachers now for 5 years, and the project is close to be completed. But the idea is that the architecture is crucial in this process, and the idea is that basically the building becomes an ecosystem that cannot be judged in terms of, or cannot be designed in terms of depuration, but instead of accumulation of diversity. There's areas that are climatized, others areas that are not climatized. There's rooms that are radically different to others. There's a presence of all the ecosystems in the area that are also, we didn't, for instance, we made a huge effort not to cut any tree. We removed the ones that were that we need to remove to use the lot in a way that would allow to host the volume that needed to be constructed. But we are keeping them in a warehouse, and we're allocating them back in the building. So the building becomes kind of in our mind, it becomes again like this ecosystem of the silica that contains biodiversity as a way for humans to be educated, self-educated in groups, in the exposition and the negotiation with many different situations and with other species. This is the way the section of the building looks like. You see how the effort is really not to depurate or to let's say, bring purity or cleanliness or anything like this to this building, but rather to allow it to become a cauldron that intensifies diversity. This is the way it looks now, or actually a couple of months ago. It's almost finished now. It's also, as you see, an accumulation of different forms of architecture. This is a house that we just finished that we call the Rambla Climate House. It's a very small house that we did actually somewhere. It's somewhere here. But before I show you the house, I would like to explain what is happening in this landscape. This is a very dry landscape in the south of Spain, in Murcia. But as you see, it's crossed by these veins in the landscape. These veins are carved lines that are carved by heavy rainfall that is very, it accumulates in a few days. So basically it's a very dry, flat landscape that has all these veins of eroded paths for the water that are normally dry, but when it rains, they accumulate the water. What is important of these ravines, these ramblas, as they're called in Spanish, is that they, in a place that is mostly dry, they accumulate corridors of life, corridors of biodiversity, corridors where the water is retained for a longer part of the year, and where animal life, insects, fungi, bacteria accumulate. This is a photograph from the 1980s where you see the way this kind of massive urbanism is being growing by flattening the land and therefore covering those carved veins, the ramblas, the ravines, and making them disappear. By doing that, they've destroyed the biodiversity of the area, also destroying their climatic role or the effect that they had as climate actors. This is the beauty of the Rambla. They are incredibly beautiful. You see there, this is when they don't have the water, but they retain this vegetation. All this has disappeared in most part of the Murcia territory, very sadly. This is the house that we designed, and the house is built on top of a tiny fragment of a Rambla that still exists, but that is a dying Rambla. What we've done is in a region that there's no political will to address issues like the degradation of the ecosystems. We were trying to do, again, at the most tiny, small, most of our projects come from very weak positions, and we use them as devices to create a public awareness on a particular issue and to promote changes among actors that could be sensitive to it. So we believe that there's a possibility of working with individual people and growing up a kind of a grassroots movement to recuperate the Ramblas just by using the gray water of individual houses. So what we did is design this house so that the gray water of showers could be channeled to this ravine, this tiny piece, this tiny fragment of the Rambla that of course is connected with the rest of the Rambla to there, with the, dying Ramblas. This is photographs after 2 years already of the house functioning. And this is the way the gray water of the house is recuperating the Rambla. Our idea is that there's a possibility for an architecture that is not catering to humans alone, but is catering to humans as part of larger entanglements of life, of more than human life. Understanding that a house that caters or that takes care of humans need to take care also of the way that their life depends and it's interconnected to the life of others. This way of doing it is in a way for me understanding also architecture as something that needs to take care of larger scales of life, not only to those that live inside the house, let's say, but also to their dependency on life that happens at other scales, like the scale of the Rambla. But of course, as you, in the same way that we need to that we see how the architecture of abstraction mobilizes aesthetics and makes visible particular realities, we wanted that this act of using the gray water to nurture this more than human life of the Rambla was also expressed clearly in the house, and it becomes sort of something that the house makes visible. And in order to do that, we created what we call this climatic crown that is connected to sensors, that digital sensors that are disposed on the soil. And when the soil either reaches a high level of dryness or a high level of acidity, the water starts to, there's this kind of automatic climatology that starts to operate on this piece of Rambla. It's like a life support device for the ecosystem, but also very enjoyable. It's really exciting to see how this climatic construction operates. Like you can be there and at one particular moment, there's this water that gets to be sprayed without anyone touching it. There's other details that I would like to explain. You see here, this is a 20 millimeter marble piece here from the area. this is very important. The house doesn't have, it's not climatized. It doesn't have air conditioning in a climate that is very hot. So what we have here, it's we working, and this is something that comes also from many conversations with forest majors from Princeton. We were using the capacity of materials to absorb radiation as a way to basically use the contact of the skin with particular materials as a way to refrigerate without energy consumption. And the third thing that you can see here in this image, for instance, is a very simple way with very low technology. This coil that you see here, it's just a black pipe that is making water circulate through there, and 90% of the hot water consumed in this house is just this simple device. So basically, by having these black pipes that actually I contributed to mount it, it's like super simple. We had some brackets and we put them. Actually, the owner of the house, another architect from my office and myself, we mounted it. And by putting all this here, basically, we reduced 90% the consumption of hot water in this house, produced by energy. We feel that this is sort of a way to understand that architecture can also become a way to advocate for trans-species justice. And I would like to finish with this project that is very sad for me, how it became so current, or what is the current importance of this. This is the way gas, again, it's channeled through Ukraine to Europe, a big part through Ukraine. You know that there's now the Nord Stream 2 being discussed as a way to avoid Ukraine and basically allowed Russia to directly bypass Ukraine and distribute gas from Germany. And that's, of course, at the core of the war that we're seeing right now, right? This is the Nord Stream pipelines from Russia that are in basically the war came to a certain extent because this was getting delayed. So the control of the goal of invading Ukraine is to protect the people that are subjected to abuse, genocide from the Kiev's regime, and to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. For me, it's very painful to read this because the story of the victims of Nazism in Ukraine is very painful. And in particular because one of the first places that was attacked during this war was Babinjar, the landscape where more than 200,000 people were killed during World War II and by the Nazis and then also by the Soviet forces. And we won the competition, I think 2 years ago, to build, to design the museum, the Babinjar Museum of Memory and Oblivion, a research center to account for the crimes of that happened during World War II in Babinjar, in this particular part of Kiev that was bombed at the beginning of the war. These are images, photographs that I took in Babinjar, but then we examined them with eco-forensic experts. Each of them is telling the story of what happened here. The first days of the invasion of Ukraine by the Nazis, or the occupation of Kiev by the Nazi forces, they identified that Babinjar, that has also a landscape very similar to the house in Murcia with ravines, could be used to turn that land into a machine to kill people without, at a massive scale. The ravines could be used so that they could hide to those that were waiting in line to be killed, the instances where people were killed. So basically they would patiently wait to be killed without knowing what was happening a few meters in front of them. These people would be killed by being shot. Then they would be, basically they would be asked to get naked, to undress. Then their clothes, some of them would be taking care of their clothes. They would be put apart and classified. Then they would keep advancing in line to the ravine. In the ravine, they would be shot, and someone will take them and take the bodies and place them elsewhere. There would be a whole, let's say, scientific organization of the killing process that would be done in association with the landscape. These are the first forensic work that was developed there to understand what had happened. The bodies were buried there, but then before the war, when the Nazi felt that they were losing the war, they unburied all these cadavers and they burned them, and that is actually what you can see here. Forensic ecologists can track the presence of the ashes of humans in the composition of the soil by looking at the species that can grow here. The ecological composition, the cosmopolitical composition of Babinjar is telling the presence, is speaking of the presences of human debris. And that's something that can be tracked, everything. The trees were cut to burn the bodies of those that have been previously buried at the time that the Nazis knew that they were losing the war. So the composition of the forest is mostly done through very early, very young trees that allowed to very specifically track when the tragedy happened and in what areas of the Babinjar. Even the presence of animal is telling us about the presence of ashes, human ashes in the ground, and only animals that can tolerate the presence of that acidity can be found there. When we look at this, it's basically we see that there's an entire ecosystem that at all different scales is registering, is composed by the tragedy. History is not something of the past. The forms of life that happen here are directly imbricated in what happened there during World War II. This is something that it's invisible to most people living in Ukraine. And actually that invisibility, that oblivion, is what allows Putin to claim that Kyiv is now a Nazifying regime. In order to produce a history that is unavoidable, architecture was called to produce a research center in this particular place. What we propose is use the actual materiality that could be found here to allow it to directly express and narrate the story that is still part of the living realities of Babinjar. We propose the museum is to be hosted in this existing building. The reason why it needs to be here is that it's the only place that can be guaranteed that there's not human remains. We don't want to bury it in places where there's human remains, so we work in doing foundations. So basically, the entire museum is concentrated in this tiny building because it's the only place that we know that we can work without affecting burials. But our design was based on the possibility of raising the roof 20 meters and going down to the earth 15 meters so we can bracket the entire ecosystem that is living as the tragedy. Our project is basically expanding the building so it becomes an observatory, kind of an inquiring device, a parliament that allows those presences that are there to speak through research, through science, through art, through debate, through political action, but also to the very act of a building that brackets that reality and embraces it in a very literal way. But a literal way that, of course, allows to see, to hear, the extension of the areas that are not covered by trees because the composition of the soil doesn't allow trees to grow, or to go down to the earth and identify what are the stratums that were transformed by the action of killing, burying, unburying, and burning. This is what I wanted to bring today here. I believe that architecture is deeply entangled in the making of societies. And it's not just, let's say, a neutral box that hosts the social, but it's actually part of the assemblages. There's no difference between walls, bodies, cuts, toxicity, air, in the way that they participate in the making of reality. And it's only through new conceptual and practical tools that allowed us to operate across scales, to understand how things like assets in the soil are directly connected to the form of architecture, or that allowed us to understand that owning the landscape as a way to produce inequality is something that is constructed through the collaboration of many different forms of design, that we can understand what is the power of architecture to operate politically, and we can mobilize architecture as a force for activism. Thank you very much.
Andrés, thank you very much. We've asked you here to talk for about an hour, so I'm sure we've got a little bit of time left within that hour for questions.
Of course, of course. I'm super happy if there's questions.
Yeah, I might take the mic around. Do I need to take the mic for questions? Right, so I'm going to take the mic.
Yes.
And hand it back to you without dropping it, if we can do that. Okay. Does anybody have a question? Want the microphone? Come on, I've gone all this way to pick up the microphone. I have to ask you a question.
How you doing? That was a great presentation. So one could argue that the best intervention environmentally would be no intervention. So how can you argue your interventions then? So one could argue that the best intervention would be no intervention. The best architecture, environmentally speaking, would be no architecture.
I have to take it back.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The big part of, or undoing interventions, right? That would be, yeah. Yeah, the question is incredibly important. The best intervention could be non-intervening, right? No intervention at all. And that, I think, is the case in many situations, right? Like we could question if there's a need for certain architecture to happen, and maybe the best architectural action is not doing anything at all, right? And there's kind of discourse in that respect from the square in Bordeaux by Lacaton and Basal, for instance, right? Or the culture of decoupling, or the whole culture of decrease, right? Of the growth. For me, it's going to the work that I've shown. That is never an option in these projects because the non-intervention gives continuity to process of violence. So I would agree with you totally, and I can recall many moments in which we've been asked to do things and we claim that should never be done, you know, and we refuse to participate in many projects, and we advise not to do them and publicly claim that it should never happen, you know. So, but in other cases, action, it's a responsibility. Intervention is needed because there's a situation of violence, for instance, or there's an imbalance of power that requires action. And it's, I agree with you that it's very important to understand that calibrate the action and understand where to place it or where not to place it is a big part of the technology, let's call, that architecture works with. And I agree with you, it's a very, very important point that you're doing. And there's this, I mean, there's many references. You know the story of Theodore Price that was hired by a family to design a private swimming pool for the suburban house. Do you know this? And he said, okay, come back in 2 weeks or something like that. I don't remember the details, but something like that, you know. And then he had a map of all the public swimming pools in the area. And they say, okay, here's your swimming pool. You can go to this swimming pool, you can go to this swimming pool. You know, so there's a trajectory of this that we have to give importance, right? Maybe that project by Theodore Price, it's the Ville Savoie, right, of our times, right? We might be in the need of claiming public infrastructures instead of private. Yeah, so it's a very good point. I agree with you.
So I'm going to get you to ask the question, then you have to pause for the answer, if that's okay. So you've got to ask a question.
Okay. So phenomenal presentation. Thank you so much for coming here and showing us all of your research and your work. One key part that I pulled out was how public money can become private money or private ownership. So, you have these public pavilions or these public community centers that somehow get privatized by other people. What are ways that you can mitigate that? And what are things that maybe your firm is doing to help lower that happening?
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I'd like to answer it or address your question with two different kind of directions. One is a general commentary on publicness. In the 2000s, there was a great focus on from let's say engaged architects or architectural practices on public space, which I think is great, and we have to preserve that tradition of creating a space of gathering, of mutual, let's say, collective empowerment. It's incredibly important, right? The life of squares, parks. At the same time, I think that my feeling is that we need to also expand the notion of publicness, not only to, let's say, a space of gathering, which I insist is crucial. In no way I want my words to be understood as undermining that, but it's also important to expand the notion of publicness to the assemblages and how they are containing forms of collectiveness that are held accountable. And I think that when it comes, for instance, with taxation, is at the center of that. Because, of course, taxation is one of these big issues, right, of our times. And the amount of money that is escaping taxation and who's paying taxes and who's not paying taxes, or what is paying taxes, it's a big issue. And publicness is now not only space provision, but it's also the accountability of those flows of money. And in the same way, we could say that citizenship, the publicness of citizenship, is a crucial priority in our times. It's been in the past as well, but now it's crucial because a big part of our societies are composed by people that are not entitled or are not recognized as citizens. So those trajectories, those threads of connections, those assemblages are incredibly on the need of being identified as accountable or as being held accountable. And I think that your question, one of the answers for it or the ways to address it is that architecture needs to clarify other methodologies to scrutinize publicness that are a little bit more complex and more invisible. So, and that's our job. It's the job that architects of our times need to dedicate time, in the same way that the architects of the post-war in Europe had to dedicate time to imagining and inventing, or for instance, the architects of the contemporary Chile have to recognize places to challenge elitism, for instance, now, right, which is a big discussion. Or, so in my opinion, it's very important that we are able to read reality and to understand that the same architecture of 20 years ago is not necessarily effective in dealing with the concerns and the issues that are emerging now. Now, going to your question very rapidly, how do we do that? How do we engage with that? We do it in many different ways. And of course, I don't want to present our practice as exemplary or as perfect or anything like that. We're facing always difficulties, limits. We have to identify what are the limits of what we can do. For me, research is directly part of my practice. So kind of sharing ideas with you and discussing with you is for me as important as doing a building, let's say. It's the same. There's no difference. I think it's the same way of constructing connections that are the ones that I'm doing in Venice, for instance, connecting the sharks with advocates for them or with decision makers. It's in these kind of connections and articulations, that's architecture for me. So we can do it through research, but we do it in many other ways. For instance, we've been transforming for the last years museum in Madrid. It's the Centro de Arte 2 de Mayo, is called CA2M. And we did it because we won a competition. The competition was intended or was expecting architectural proposals to demolish the existing building and build a new one. And we won the competition by proposing not to demolish the building, and in a way a little bit related to your previous question, but rather using public money in a much more effective way, less money, but using it to transform progressively the building in a collective discussion that could be public. So we could do things, a few things, then open a debate, invite the communities to come and discuss them, and plan the next steps by listening to everyone and discussing, and then do the next steps. We've been like this for, I believe, 5-6 years, and the building is not going to be finished ever. We probably will keep having, but by doing that, we changed the way public money was used. We made it be scrutinized very publicly. We made it in a way, we used the money in a way that would gather public opinion, would make all the process quite transparent to a certain extent, and that's an example. We, for instance, did a project that was very critical to Peter Eisenman's museum, Ciudad de la Cultura, these buildings like this, that was called the 12 Actions to Make Peter Eisenman Transparent. And those were actions that were implemented during the construction process, so that the economy of the project, the contracts between the construction companies and the city would be made public. So the entire process became public. And that was crucial, because by making the entire thing public, many things changes. And as a result, in part of what we did, a big part of the project was never built. So you can find that probably online. It's called 12 Actions to Make Peter Eisenman Transparent. So that's the kind of projects that we've developed to allow for a public scrutiny of money and somehow track how it circulated in society through architecture.
Going once, twice, so 3 times. So I sold. I just want everybody to join with me to thank Andrés for this extraordinary lecture, these revelations and these observations that you've come out to this part of the world to share with us. So we're deeply grateful. So thank you, incredible. Thank you very much.